So I was born here. That was one thing. Um, Society, the system of the day, challenged that in lots of different ways. So you end up challenging yourself. And from a personal perspective, there's a point at which I think being born in the UK that you, even though you brought up in the Jamaican community, you want to own that space. You want to be part of it. And at the same time, you're challenged by both the doctrine you're receiving from your immediate community, your family, and so forth, and then this alternative doctrine that you're receiving from society. You step out the house, it's there, it slaps you in the face, and so you have a duality, I think. So in terms of identifying and owning your space, that duality challenges who you are to your core. At one point, you're absolutely Jamaican, and then a Jamaican challenges you as to your Jamaicanness, and you have to think about that. And when I'm growing up, there were still individuals arriving from Jamaica into school, straight into the playground, straight in your face, challenging you as to, so you think you're Jamaican. And then there's society telling you, you're not from here, you don't fit in, go home. And then you got your parents who's got the Queen's picture hanging over the mantelpiece, and you're going, huh? How does that work? So you grow up with that duality, and I think it's somewhere in your teens, as you start to own your person, you have to make a decision. And certainly for me, it came through music.
Yeah.
That was the alternative education that was telling you all the stuff that was not in school, that was not coming from your parents, actually. It was through the music that you heard about an alternative history, an alternative past
Of Britain or
of blackness, of Africanness, that was giving you a link even to the Caribbean that was very different to what you were told at school, that was coming through the newspapers, that was coming through the media. I mean, all you got from school in Britain was, we saved you. You should be grateful. Without slavery, you'd have still been uncivilized. In fact, you're probably still uncivilized. So, literally, this is, if one of the remarks that at school was you're not civilized, coming from teachers. What the music offered, and this is reggae music, I should say, and an element of R&B said that, and an element of blues communicated that. And in terms of my parents, an element of jazz as well was in the house. But it was very heavily censored in comparison to what came through in reggae music, which was just blunt. This is how it is. So that whole sense didn't really come together until my teens and music.
And where and how did you start to find it? And what kind of, was it difficult to find, or did it come to you, or did you go to it? I mean, how did you begin to find it?
It's a bit of both. I think subconsciously you're moving towards it because all aspects of society is pushing you in a direction, and if you're not careful, you fall over with that force. In resisting that, you move in a slightly different direction, and so I'm moving towards trying to find out who I am. It's a constant question. Am I British? Am I Jamaican? Am I more British than I am Jamaican, or vice versa? My elder brother arrives when I'm 16 and I meet him for the first time. And he is Jamaican. That questions my Jamaicanness. He was very different in his whole mentality, his approach, his vernacular, his approach to being in Britain. I was comfortable, he was not. So in my teens, there's lots of things that caused me to move towards discovering on which side of this line do I sit? And can I be black and British? And does that dilute my Jamaicanness? These are all questions that remain constant.
And they're coming to you quite early, relatively speaking, in terms of...
Well, yeah, because if you're black and British, it's not like you have a choice. You're slapped around the face every which way, whether you're looking at a poster, watching the television, listening to the radio, the news. There was a fear that in that period with the news, when you heard anything happen on the street, you'd be going, oh, I hope it's not a black person, or just hope it's not, because that makes it more difficult for me. I grew up with sus on the streets, so there was a fear of the state in terms of the police. I mean, so in terms of seeking out who you are, it wasn't as though there was a choice. You had to be pretty dumb and insensitive, blind, and locked up in a very dark place not to be impacted on.
Yeah.
Identity for the average black person, black youth, black male back then was, if you identified with being British, it somehow diluted your blackness because you were identifying with a space that didn't want you, were saying that you were other, that was telling you to leave. But everything that you knew about identity up to that point is heavily attached to your place of birth, and you're born here. This is the language you speak. This is the accent you have. This is your main experience. So that challenge, I'm in a school where the majority of kids are white. It's mixed, but the majority of schools, kids are white. They're comfortable in their whiteness. But they could still turn around to me and feel totally empowered to say, go home. And I'm going, go where? I'm born here. But even in saying that, it didn't feel 100% like I'm on solid ground. So you grew up with that, and you grew up with the media, the politics of the day, all challenging your sense of identity. So as much as you believed in the fact that this is your place of birth, this is your home, it didn't sit on solid ground.
And so music was a way that you kind of accelerated your, sense of who you were. It gave you weapons, if you like, to work on.
Well,
it gave you clues.
It gave you an alternative space to contemplate that sense of self. It gave you alternative narratives, alternative perspectives from other spaces. And as you delved into that, it gave you alternative choices that you could make. It gave you alternative information that empowered you to think in different ways. It's not that you agreed with everything initially, it's just that it was coming from another source, and that source was black. And that source was grounded, or it felt more grounded. And that source was anti-establishment. So it started to identify with your challenges. And that source seemed to be talking directly to you. And that was really powerful then as well. And that source was disliked by the state. And that in itself meant it was in a similar place. So it wasn't immediate, but it didn't take long for that to impact on that whole thought process. The music certainly empowered you to think is that you could be anything you wanted to be, that you can say anything you want to say. And this is a space that will accommodate that kind of thinking. So from that perspective, initially it wasn't so much empowering, it was just an alternative way of looking at things. And the Jamaican audience, forget about punks, Jamaican audience would tell you in no uncertain terms, if you should pursue this career pathway. And the first test, because you interrupted a sound system back then, you went on and replaced a sound system that was playing tunes they wanted to hear.
Yeah.
So our first mission was, could we play songs as well as they sounded on the sound system, so that when we went on, you really wouldn't notice. Yeah. That was the idea initially. If they didn't notice we were on stage, we've got away with it and we could pursue. So that was our objective. And there's a main club in Handsworth that was a goal for like almost a year. We want to play at the club. And if we can play at the club, I can't remember the name of the club, whether it's the Rialto or a club on the Soho Road, which was populated by the Jamaican community. Santa Rosa, it could have been Santa Rosa, yeah. If we could play there and survive, we could continue. And when I say survive, I mean, you're getting a bottle in the head. That's what's coming at you. You know, it was like, come off! And you had a few seconds to process that, and then there's a bottle coming because you're interrupting the sound system. So it's hardcore. There is a slow, and then it became really explosive, reaction to Eric Clapton's speech in Birmingham, where he aligns himself with Enoch Powell. And he's talking about niggers and coons and wogs should go home, and all these migrants are kind of screwing up the country and whatever. And this is a rant that goes on for 20 minutes. And the reaction to that came from a character called Red Saunders, who sends an email. There was some bloody email, but he sends a letter into the music press, the enemies, the melody makers, the sound and sound, says, look, the idea that we have racists and racism in rock is completely wrong. The legacy of rock is blues, it's R&B, we need to stamp this out. And he got sackfuls of mail. And this created a groundswell within the audience, the community of music fans, to say we want to challenge this idea of racism in music, because the climate back then was the National Front. It was the politics of the day, and reggae's right central to that. And so amongst the younger members of the audience, and I stressed that this was a youth movement, there was a sense that we need to come together. And what Rock Against Racism actually facilitated was this coming together. So there's a sense in the audience that we're all challenging the state. This was coming from punks, it's coming from the black musicians, and as young people we're saying, we're just musicians, we're just an audience. We don't need to embrace this nonsense that's coming from upstairs from the system. You know, we need to challenge that. And so punks were challenging that, we were challenging that, and even the confused racist skinheads were challenging that, because they came to the gigs. You know, and anecdotally, I tell this sometimes, I can't remember where we were, we'd done the sound check and we went out to get something to eat. And as I said, it was the norm then. If you saw 4 or 5 white guys with high top Dr. Martens, skinheads and braces on the opposite side of the road, there's a good chance they're going to come after you, right? And there's 3 of us returning to the gig after just doing a sound check, and there's people coming to the gig for the performance, and we noticed there's about 3 or 4 guys on the opposite side of the street, big skinheads, and they're heading towards us, and we're kind of all walking in the same direction to the gig, and they checked us out and they started to cross over, right? And as they got closer to us, because you could see the aggression on their faces and whatever, they start to lose the aggression, and this perplexed look takes over and confusion takes over, and he goes, "Are you in the band?" And we went, "Yeah," and he goes, right, and they looked at each other and goes, "Just as well, mate, just as well, because you know what I mean, out here it's everyone for themselves." And I go, what do you mean? And he goes, "Well, if you weren't in the band, you know, if we didn't recognise you, you know, it'd have been different, like." And saying, "But you're coming to see us." Yeah, you're all right, we're coming to see you. And there was that confusion. So they're coming to see you, they're paying to come to see you, but they beat you up on the street, you know. And so it was about spaces. Inside the venue, it was all love and peace until they really liked you, and then they try and beat you up, you know, or just rush the stage and start mushing and chucking beer at you. Or on the street, even after the gig, you're fair game again amongst certain sections of the community. So it was a very confused period, but the majority of young people were all about let's come together. And amongst those, there were skinheads that were, shit, we love the music, but we really hate black people. How's that work? Yeah. And you'd meet them. Do you remember Soul to Soul? Oh, do you remember Omar? You know, do you remember Loose Ends? These are phenomenal artists that have helped shape British popular music.
So what is this gap that happens then? This lack? How come it doesn't get amplified? How come it doesn't get mythologized? There are times when it seems like it was about to.
Because
like at your period, like Soul to Soul, but then is it
because it's how music translates, and you know it's taken me a while to understand this. It's how that cultural contribution translates into text. It's how it's written about. It's how it's filmed. It's how it's remembered. It's how it becomes legacy. It's how it becomes heritage, and that process means that you have to be written about. You have to transfer that whole experience into words. You have to end up in libraries. You have to be researched and regurgitated in academia. And you have to be studied. And one of the things that happens to black culture, and it's not peculiar to the UK, is that if you're not written about in a particular way, you don't exist in a particular way. If you are written about in a particular way, that's how you're perceived to be. And the gap between is actually what really happens. The black community hasn't written about itself, foremostly. So you don't have that first person perspective out there. We've not ended up in books as the first person. So we're not writing about ourselves and putting ourselves in books. We've not made films about our culture and what it means to be British and black. It's always a third party writing about it from that perspective. And that perspective has always been within a pop context, which means it's robbed that contribution in terms of a black British contribution. And it's been submerged in this pop idea, pop perspective, which doesn't credit the source. And so, and this is important. Internationally, there is no such thing as black British music. We have pop acts, and then suddenly, oh, whoa, you're a jungler. So how does jungle fit into pop? How does drum and bass fit in? How does lovers rock fit in? These are key components of popular music in Britain.
What's the footnote in a bigger story? Because British pop in itself, because of where it begins with the Beatles and what happens to it next, it overwhelms the narrative, and other things go missing too, but definitely this goes missing.
This goes missing. Assumes it was there. It was in the first place.
What?
Going missing assumes it was there in the first place, and the point is.
But it is as a thing.
It is as a thing.
I mean,
amongst those that
the
are in.
Keep coming. The rhythms keep coming.
Over the last 5 decades, one of the key catalysts in popular music is the black British contribution. You look at that in terms of the mods in the 60s and what happened in the UK in terms of blues beat and early ska. You look in the 70s as to what happened with dub and reggae. You look in the early 80s, it was reggae and British ska again. And each time we're revitalising British popular music. You go to the 90s, you got jungle, you got drum and bass, you got two-step, you got trip hop, you got dubstep, now we got grime. Each time we've had to fight as a black community, often circumventing the mechanics and infrastructure of the music industry to profile. And in each time we educate the industry as to a new way of doing things, a new sound, a new approach. And who do we galvanise first? The British audience, right? And it's normally a young audience that is just passionate about the music that engages. So when you say a thing, it is the British system that we're constantly fighting, and we're fighting that in 2018. The Brit Awards failed to nominate grime in 2016 and was chastised for it. Why? Because they said, oh, grime is not actually a legitimate genre. So said the OCC, the official chart system. So why is it not an official genre? Because it didn't go through their channels. They were not making money from it. The fact is that grime went outside, understood contemporary technology, reinvented itself, because grime's been around 15, 16 years now. That's several lifetimes in music. And came back on top each time, going all the way back to So Solid. So the idea that it's not a thing is difficult to contemplate when you look at what black British music has done in Britain. I haven't even got on to what it's done for American production, which has never credited what we've done. I've not gone into film music, which has again benefited from how we've approached beats. This is a key component of popular music. It always has been. And in the UK, there's a unique contribution through the Jamaican community, through the Caribbean, but specifically, because we're talking about reggae, the Jamaican community, that's never been fully credited. And you say, why? Because it challenges the very notion of Britishness. It goes right to the core of, hold on, you're African. How does that equate with British? In 2018, right at the forefront, the cutting edge of popular music in Britain is the black contribution, and it should be acknowledged as such. And reggae has pioneered that. And part of what we were doing is making that link to what is the legacy of reggae in Britain. And grime is the contemporary legacy. And you talk to certain artists, they'll link it back to my dad, my uncle, my brother ran a sound system. It goes all the way back to turntablism and Big U and U-Roy back in the day. And I don't see why we should be fighting in the UK to acknowledge that when we were the capital, unlike in America, where you have to push them to acknowledge that actually hip-hop derives from Jamaican music. That should not be the case in the UK.